and there's a little restaurant across the street. We all went over there and eat breakfast for a quarter. And then we decided we'd catch a bus and go to zoo. And this big gorilla, he's still at the zoo there at St. Louis, but he's stuffed now. But he was live. He was in a cage behind 2 sets of glass and 2 sets of bars. He was a monster. And Buddy Trollinger walked up to the rail there, and he popped his false teeth at this gorilla. And it made him so mad, the gorilla would make a sashay around him and come squat down and look at him, you know. And finally, he jumped up and turned around and crossed each cheek of his rear and flashed Buddy. And everybody that was there looking at that just broke up. There was one lady that had 2 little girls. She got tickled. She just squatted, sat down on the floor. But I was embarrassed. I got away from that. But that's something I'll never forget. And that sure was funny. But there was JC and the guy that forgot to get off it. He slept by Union City, but he didn't bother him. He said, "I don't care. I'll just go on to St. Louis, be off." And him and Buddy and myself. And we had a big time that day. We took in the zoo.
Did the GM&O go into St. Louis, or just went into East St. Louis and into Chicago?
No, it went right on into St. Louis on Market Street where the old Union Station is.
Okay.
Yeah, back in there. And of course, the trains out of there went on to Chicago. Of course, back then, everybody rode trains. You didn't see a lot of cars.
And obviously the interstates weren't built yet.
No.
Okay. Well, were there any trains that ran straight from Chicago all the way to Mobile, or would they stop and exchange stuff?
No, they come into St. Louis, and then they just change trains at St. Louis and get on the Rebel.
What were passenger trains had certain names in that time? What are the passenger train names you remember?
Well, we called ours the Little Rebel and the Big Rebel. I mean, the Big Rebel ran from Mobile to St. Louis, and Little Rebel ran from New Orleans to St. Louis. And you've seen pictures I've got of the Little Rebel. That was a neat little train. It had sleepers on it.
Was it diesel or gasoline?
It was diesel pool.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But it was a neat little train. After they finally pulled it off, it sat down at Island for years. And then somebody said some railroad out in Mexico or somewhere bought it and got it. I don't know. But anyway.
It may still be running today somewhere if they haven't scrapped it.
Could be.
So what other stories can you remember after the St. Louis trip?
Oh, gosh.
You gave one story of a close call you had where you almost got your legs run over. What other kind of close calls do you remember having? Anything?
Oh, well, I've had a lot of close calls. I mean, getting on and off, falling. But I was tough. I'd get up and keep going. Yeah, I told you about before I went to work on the railroad. I was 16 years old. I worked for a funeral home, Alexander Ray Funeral Home on Chester Street. It was right next door to the YMCA, I mean the old armory. And George Smith had a lot of young men working for him, W.T. Brewer and Slick Johnsey. Anyway, people that I had gone to school, was going to school with and all. I was still going to school then. And George called me and I come over and went to work for him. That's when he lived upstairs in an apartment over the funeral home on Main Street. And the twins were just youngsters then. But anyway, I made a run with him one day. We got an emergency call. And there was a hospital on the corner of Baltimore and Royal. And a big hospital. And a woman had gotten hit by a train, number 11, the little dinky passenger train, hit this woman on Baltimore Street. Her name was Petty, and knocked her down in that ditch and just...
Was she in a car?
She was in a car.
Okay.
Her mother and daddy lived in the house next door to a little grocery store there, right off the railroad track. And she had just pulled out and pulled in front of the train. And George got the call and called me, and he drove and I went with him.
To clarify, in what year was this? You were 17?
This had to be in 1942.
42. They did not have ambulance services back then like we know it now. The funeral home, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right. They didn't have the hearse that you used on funerals. We used to pick up emergency.
People. Okay, so go ahead. You got the call.
Yeah, we got the call and we went there on Baltimore Street, right next door to the hospital. And this woman's car was down the ditch. I took the cot down. There's a lot of big rock there, and got her on the cot and got her strapped on the cot.
What did she look like? Her
She
injuries
was kind of tall, slim, but she was a beautiful woman. Her name was Petty. Her husband run a dairy here in Jackson somewhere. Because I never will forget him. But anyway, George kind of got sick there on me, you know, because she was mangled and cut up like she was. And I managed to get her in the back of the ambulance on the cot. And I don't know why we didn't go on down to the emergency room. We wasn't 200 yards from the entrance to the emergency room. And in my mind, I still can't figure out why we put her in the ambulance. And George drove. He turned that street just after on Baltimore Street, after you cross the railroad track. He turned right. He went to Chester. He come back on Royal and back up by Memorial Hospital, emergency room. And we took the woman out, and I rode back there with her, pulled some clots of blood out of her throat. And we took her out and took her in the emergency room, and they had to go up to the second floor to get some kind of pump to suck that out of her throat. And during that, while I was waiting for that, she died. She couldn't have lived anyway. She was in too bad shape. And I remember Miss Petty, her husband, they had called him. He come up, and when they told him he couldn't go in and see her, she had gone. He rolled around out there on the grass, just crying. I felt so sorry for him. But I had told this story to somebody, and Mr. Driver, who still lives here in Jackson, and he's a real smart man. He knows all about railroading. He worked in the shops. He said, "Old Beard's telling it just like it was, because I was standing there and watched it all." And
he, at the time, Mr. Driver was one of those men you said would go out with the flag
no,
and stop traffic. No? What did he do at that time? Was he just there?
he was working at Island's shop. He had something to do with making wheels or something. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway,
He happened to be nearby and saw
he
it
just
happen.
happened to be there.
Okay.
And saw it all. He just happened. And verified what I had told about it. Yeah, but yeah, George Smith and I talked about it a lot of times, and then George there at the last, he got so, he hardly recognized me. I'd see him at a funeral or something, and one of the boys say, "Hey, Dad, there's Ben." And he looked at me like, well, who the heck are you? So, but George Smith was a fine fella.